listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, your host, John Verry. And with me today, Raveed Laeb. Did I get the last name right, Raveed?
Yeah, that's perfectly correct.
Hey, excellent. How are you today?
Very good, John. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. I enjoyed our preliminary conversation, and I think we'll bring some value today. So I always like to start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day.
Sure. So my name is Raveed. I live in Israel, born and raised. Actually not born, but mostly raised. I work for a cyber threat intelligence company called KELA. I lead product development, so I'm the VP product. Prior to that, I've spent the last 7 or 8 years in KELA as well, doing anything from research to pre-sales and a bunch of other stuff in the middle. And before that, my background is actually in military intelligence. I think like a lot of people in the industry, specifically the Israeli military intelligence, where I spent also around 6 years. And on the day-to-day, I try to make our products better, to perform better in the market and help our clients protect themselves in the best way possible, hopefully.
Cool. I always ask, what's your drink of choice?
So I think probably mostly... the word escapes me. Sorry, I always keep forgetting how you guys call that in America. So I think mostly sparkling water. That would be that, or club soda. I actually have like a liter right here. I never leave like anywhere with a lot of sparkling water. Other than that, I think just to fit the way I look, like glasses, beard, and tattoos, I'm very big into IPAs lately, so beer. Kind of, stereotypical, I would say.
Yeah, question for you. In Israel, is there a big movement in microbreweries and things of that nature? Like in the U.S., it's huge, right? There's literally thousands of breweries now.
So actually, there is. It's not, I think, as prevalent it is as in the States, but it has picked up very much the past like 5 or 6 years. I think 7, 8 years ago, you couldn't find any beer that's not like a huge, super commercial brewery in any store probably, and now it's all over. I very much enjoy that. I also come like from a home where my parents brewed beer before it was cool, so I really kind of close the loop there.
Yeah, and listen, it was probably cool then. It just wasn't popular.
Yeah, correct.
All right.
Correct.
So looking forward to our conversation because I wanted to change the discussion a bit relative to the way that we usually talk about security. So I would say we tend to focus on security and compliance for good reason, right? It builds organizational value and it reduces the risk from bad actors. But we rarely talk about the bad actors themselves. And in our preliminary discussion, you talked a lot about bad actors. You talked about means, motive, and opportunity. Why do you think that understanding your adversary provides so much value?
So that's a very good question. I think it really comes down, in a sense, to the essence of what is intelligence work, which I could go on about for 2 hours, and I'll try to hold myself. But generally speaking, I think in intelligence, what you're trying to do is to provide good advice on the best course you can take in a given moment. Basically, really, intelligence comes down to recommending a path of action to decision makers. Now, what intelligence can't do necessarily, and that is kind of a common bias that people have, is that you can't get into the mind of someone else. You can't predict the future. What you can try and do is explain and describe the present, and that is what you can use, or that's what decision makers can use to make good decisions, like when push comes to shove, or to plan strategy, or basically anything, right? So where that actually meets your actual question, and I'll try not to go off to faraway lands, is that in cybersecurity, if you want to make a good decision, or a decision that is driven by stuff that you can actually measure and see, what you need to try and do is to understand what bad guys do, because you're playing an adversarial game. You're trying to do something where every action that you take might and probably will have a counter reaction by an adversary. So knowing what the adversary is trying to do, knowing what they want, and basically understanding the landscape via these means and understanding the present and what's going on outside your perimeter, that's the way I think cyber threat intelligence professionals or practitioners view intelligence. That's the key thing. Because unless you look outwards at the adversary, you can only see what's happening inwards, and that's usually not too indicative of how the reality actually looks like. I think even more on top of that, when you think about most of the attacks that you hear about now and most of the financial damage incurred by attacks, and if you take into account a lot of research that has been done in the last few years, what you kind of get is that most attacks that really drive damage to organizations are financially driven. A very interesting data point for me, it has been a recurring theme, but just to really hit that on the head lately, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, the 2022 edition, notes that I think over 90% of network intrusions are performed by actors who are financially driven. So if we're talking about people trying to make money and working within a market, that really, I think, hits the nail on the head on why you should understand the market, simply because, again, it's a market. Cyber criminals and organizations are in constant competition because they want the assets that you have, but you want your assets to yourself. So you're basically competing with an adversary, and probably just like you would spend some time and effort understanding your actual competitors in business, doing the same for your adversaries, understanding what it is that they want, and what you have that has value to them, probably is a very good way to start understanding how to better protect yourself and how to plan your defense strategy.
Interesting. Quick question. As you were talking, I started thinking about an area that I'm interested in, game theory. And you think about game theory, you hear about it in politics, you hear about it in investing, you hear about it in sports gambling and things of that nature. Have you ever heard of someone applying game theory principles to cybersecurity?
That's interesting. I actually haven't. I'm not big on that side, I think, of the industry. Generally speaking, I wouldn't say I'm too big into game theory aside, I think, from the kind of the few things that popularized it when it became like much more prevalent like 10, 15 years ago. I haven't, but that would be a very interesting notion. I do know, or I have seen in military intelligence, people that try to use the same principles to describe behaviors and to try and understand why adversaries behave in the way they do.
Well, yeah, because what's interesting to me about game theory is sometimes the logical play is not the optimal play, right? I mean, I like to play poker, and like in poker, right? There are some times where making a particular play now, will have, what we refer as negative EV in the near term, but higher EV in the long term, expected valuation. So it's just interesting. I'd never really thought about that in cybersecurity concepts, but as a guy who comes out of the threat intelligence community, I thought that might have been something you've heard of, something maybe for both of us to look at, because it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that sounds actually a cool way to think about it.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I've heard you speak before, and you've used what I'm going to call conventional business terms like business models and supply chains when you were talking about cyber criminals and how a cybercrime operates. Can you explain that, and can you maybe give some examples of what you mean by these business models and the cybercrime supply chain?
Of course. So basically, again, going back to the fact, or going back to the claim at least, I wouldn't say that I'm objectively correct. But going back to what I've said before about financially driven cybercrime and how that constitutes probably most of the threats that a lot of organizations are seeing, I've mentioned that there is a market, because if you want to make money out of something, there has to be supply and demand. And just like that, a lot of the same concepts from like traditional normal business apply here as well. An analogy that I like to use is kind of to refer to the what a lot of people look at as the golden days of startups, where you'd have like an entrepreneur building $1 billion company out of their garage with 2 other people, and you have like 2-3 guys doing everything from coding to marketing to customer success and anything in between. And as an organization grows, you understand that you need people who specialize in things. You need engineers, and you need DevOps people, and you need marketing people, and you need sales people. And that is kind of the same thing that we see happening in cybercrime. As cybercriminals create better business models to make more money, they also need to specialize. They need people with very specific skills, and that creates a kind of an ecosystem where different cybercriminals offer services and goods and products that can be exchanged, where cybercriminals hire one another to do things that others can't, and essentially where they have a space to cooperate and to help one another in a distributed business, because cybercrime mostly is a distributed business. And just to go into a few examples, one that I very much like, because I think the industry has been buzzing around that lately, is what we call initial access brokers. Essentially a very specific tier of threat actor, cybercriminal threat actor even more so specifically, that developed around ransomware or as kind of a bottom feeder for the ransomware ecosystem in the last few years. Now, just to reiterate a few things that you've said, when we talk about ransomware, usually what we hear is a type of attack or a type of breach, but really ransomware is a business model, just like you've said before. When bad actors have access to something, to your network, to something within it, the way they monetize it and the way they make money out of it is essentially by extorting you or extorting the organization. And really, in that sense, the ransomware, the executable that runs on your machines, hopefully not your machines, is just the technical means of a business model. It's the product that they use to make money off of what they have achieved via network intrusion. Now, as that business model grows and becomes more distributed, and you have a lot of competitors, like different groups that compete with one another, what you essentially get, like I alluded to before, is an ecosystem. So at first, ransomware actors starting using affiliates to actually deploy the ransomware and carry out the actual attack within organizational networks. And affiliates are kind of like salespeople, usually, not always, but usually. So they make commissions. So if you bring in a very good deal, like a very big organization that you were able to compromise, you get a very good commission. Like you split with the operators 60-40, for example, each group in their own license, or again, specifically business model. But really, what that creates is a lot of incentives and a lot of competition between different groups and different affiliates. And what affiliates have understood, say 2-3 years ago, is that they can't do it all. They can't deploy the ransomware, which really requires a specific skill set, but also get the initial beachhead within the organizational network. So provide or like produce kind of that first part of the intrusion, because that's a very different skill set, at least theoretically. So what was created is kind of another hierarchy where we'd see and still do see opportunistic actors who have their own business model, where they get in one way or another access to an organizational network, be it by compromising credentials or exploiting vulnerabilities or performing social engineering and so on. They establish a foothold within the organization's network, and then they just go and sell it to anyone who wants to buy. Now that can be a ransomware affiliate that would go and monetize that access and make money out of it via their business model, which is again ransomware. Or in theory, and also in practice, but not probably as common, that could be a different kind of actor who would use that network access to, for example, establish a foothold in the network that can then be used to steal credit cards or payment information that's relayed through the system and go and sell that in the cyber criminal market. So really, just to conclude kind of the train of thought, is that I think the most interesting thing to me about ransomware is not kind of the technical complexity, it's the fact that it's a way to monetize network access. And what we see is kind of a gig economy surrounding that. Different people doing different things, like initial access brokers that specialize in obtaining and selling and maturing a network access. But we also see ransomware groups working with translators because you want your ransom notes to be written in very good English, or you want to negotiate with US-based organizations in an English, like in the language that they could understand, assuming that most of the actors do not necessarily speak English very well. Or we see them working with graphic designers, so you could have very nice banners that you could use to advertise your services. And really, what that comes down to is supply chain, right? You use it as a ransomware operator. You don't want to necessarily go and hire directly graphic designers and translators and network intruders. What you want is kind of a market that you can go to and procure these services from someone else. And I think that ransomware is just a very good example to kind of that minuscule financial ecosystem that revolves around a very, very specific cybercrime business model.
Gotcha. So a quick question for you, just for people who might not be familiar. Legitimate business models advertise on the internet, and they you can go there and find the supply chain that you need. Where do the bad guys find their supply chains, and where do they find these affiliates, and where do they find people that access brokers and people of that nature?
So unsurprisingly, they do that on the internet as well. I think a lot of vendors like to call the kind of websites that bad actors use the dark web. Me specifically, and I think that KELA, the company I work for in general, we kind of dislike that notion or that phrase, because I think it's mostly commonly used to kind of instill that fear of like the big spooky dark web, whereas in reality, what you do have is a set of websites, forums, and markets, and like Telegram and Discord, like instant messaging channels and platforms that cybercriminals just use to communicate, just like you and me would. And what we see happening is forums that you can just probably, to most of them, go and browse with your normal browser without having to go beneath any icebergs. You probably need an invitation a lot of times though. So like you would log in into one of these forums, and most of the time what you see is like screaming big bulgy banners like we would used to see on the internet 10 years ago, which cybercriminals use to advertise their services, products that they sell, markets that sell compromised payment data, and so on. So they do they do communicate openly on the internet, albeit in specialized specific parts of the internet, which is, by chance. What we do as a company is monitor them so we can provide our clients with the intelligence and the leads that they will need to protect themselves in a better way.
Gotcha. One of the things that I think is the most frequent misconception that I have when speaking with clients and potential clients is that they're quote unquote, I'm too small to be targeted, or my data isn't valuable enough to be targeted. No one cares about my data. And I believe that creates a false sense of security. Do you see the same? And it would seem that understanding how cyber criminals operate would maybe help dispel that notion. So
the answer is yes and yes, although not as frequently. So when we started doing cyber threat intelligence, and when I specifically entered the field like 7-8 years ago, we would see that a lot. We would see that even not in small organizations, also in very big organizations, and that's basically, I would say, goes back to what you alluded to, where you don't necessarily, as someone who's not a cyber criminal, think about what motives or like what motivations does a cyber criminal have. And I think there's like a very common adage that says that the vendors think in lists and attackers think in graphs. That might be true to threat hunting and network intrusions, but I think that also comes down to, or really relates to, what you were saying. We as defenders, as people who work in organizations, we see a company. We see kind of the LLC that we're a part of. We'll see the taxes that we pay. We see the organizational structure that kind of defines the people and the company. And we like to think intuitively, why would someone attack us, the company, the LLC, the organization? Attackers don't necessarily see that. What they see is assets, things that they can monetize. So, for example, you might think as about your company as, again, a set of people, an organization. A threat actor sees the servers that you have, like in the cloud, and they see that they can maybe sell access to the servers for a good few bucks, or they can use them to run a crypto miner, like if you were a few years ago. Or, coming back to ransomware as a business model, maybe no one else in the world cares about your data, but you probably do. So what would you do if someone were to encrypt it and then offer you back access for a fee? So I think what that again comes down to is attackers don't care about your business model, they care about their. There's an example that I very much like from a few years ago that was reported in the press at the time, where a Tesla AWS server was compromised by an attacker. And that's a huge company. According to the reports, the server also had like sensitive telemetry data going through it. So you'd say, oh, that's like a huge asset for foreign intelligence or for sophisticated cybercriminals. But what the cybercriminals that actually compromised it did, according to the report, was to run a crypto miner on it. And I very much like that example because it shows that there's a discrepancy in what we think about as organizations, because we think from a compliance standpoint, we know what we know. And again, the discrepancy between that and what attackers see, where they don't see your organization, they see a database that someone might pay for just because PII is worth money in the cybercriminal ecosystem. They see a server that they can use as a jump server or sell to someone. They see credentials that they can go and sell. They don't care really about the organization. They care about assets that you have that they can monetize as part of their business plan. And in that sense, each and every one of us has something that can be monetized.
Yeah, I think that idea, that word targeted, people think I'm too small to be targeted. I think they fail to understand that that a large percentage of attacks are, I'm going to refer to as opportunistic. I mean, there are many cyber criminals that have scanners running perpetually, and every new vuln that comes out, they're going to, okay, hey, there's a Joomla admin access vuln. Okay, let me set my scanner. Let me go to sleep. Let me wake up in the morning. Oh, I've got 50 potential targets, right? So, and the fact that it's you, they have no idea it's you. They have no idea it's your organization. They weren't after your organization. But once they gain that access, now, like you said, now the question is, how am I going to monetize this access in some way, right? I think you talked about crypto mining. I mean, the other one, we've seen people do things with like open S3 buckets where they were sharing, pornographic materials that could put, that they don't want to put it on their host because it's going to put them at risk, but it's putting you at significant risk. And now you have the challenge where, if you have someone compromise a server that is sitting in Amazon or Azure, and they're starting to hammer the hell out of the server and use it. I've seen clients ring up quite some big bills with compromised servers.
Exactly. I think that's a great point. The kind of relationship between organizations and attackers, or defenders and attackers, is not a zero-sum game. I think that intuitively we think about being attacked is someone reaching out to my vault and taking my money, and the money that I lose is the same amount of money that the bad person in the internet gets, and that is not the case at all. Your example with pornographic materials is a great example for that. Maybe someone just uses an S3 bucket that you have. You don't really pay a whole lot, aside from regulation, should you be caught, but they benefit. They save hosting costs, they save being chased down by law enforcement, and they basically, what they get is your reputation that they can then use to spread material in a way that's easier. We also see that happening with spam. You would see legitimate organizations be compromised, have their mail servers used to send out spam or phishing emails. You as an organization, the organization that's been attacked, you're not paying money for that, unless for the aside for the incident response that you then have to do. No one takes money from you. They gain, however, that financial benefit by exploiting something that you have, which is reputation. And even the smallest organizations that have like a very small website on the internet, they still have reputation in one way or another that can also be exploited and used to make money for bad guys should it be compromised. So I very much like that example.
Gotcha. So KELA is and people are using different terms, right? Yeah, I know. You're smiling already. Yeah, you see here, attack surface management's a big buzzword. Digital risk management, digital business and risk management, cyber threat intelligence, and there seems to be a fine line between all of them. You definitely seem at KELA to focus on cyber threat intelligence, that component. Why do you think that cyber threat intelligence is the critical component when we talk about this new evolving space?
So really circling back to my first kind of rant about intelligence and what we do with intelligence when we started talking, I think that, or my perspective and KELA's perspective on cyber threat intelligence tries to be a tiny bit more holistic, meaning intelligence is used, again, to drive decisions by decision makers. Attack surface monitoring is another process in which you collect information that you can use to then do things. For example, maybe your attack surface management tool or platform or program tells you that you have a bunch of servers up on the internet exposing a specific service to the internet. That's good to know. That could either be crucial or that could be nothing based on how that service, for example, you're exposing SSH banners to the internet. Knowing whether that's something you should take care of and when is not something that's really driven by the attack surface management. That's driven by cyber threat intelligence. Because if you want to make a good decision, you need to know, okay, do bad guys care about the things that I expose to the internet? So the way we see cyber threat intelligence is a bit more all-encompassing. Cyber threat intelligence is a key component in actually doing things with attack surface management findings. It's also a key component in knowing what to do with DRP, digital risk protection findings. And also it's a practice of its own. So we like to call what we do cyber threat intelligence because we think that's like the general discipline. However, we ourselves have a lot of elements of attack surface management and digital risk protection. We just like to think of them as another byproduct or another deliverable of the broader cyber threat intelligence work. I think also that is kind of a disputed term in the industry. I think that if you'd go between different vendors and different people who do CTI, you would probably hear very different answers from each one about what they do.
So it seems to me like cyber threat intelligence it contextualizes risk and vulnerability information.
Correct.
Okay.
I would very much say that.
Okay.
Context is king, really, in CTI.
Yeah. Well, context is king in security, right? Because unless you understand, specifically the information, laws and regulations that govern its operation, client contractual obligations, legal obligations, unless you really understand, then how do you know how to appropriately store? That's the idea of people doing gap assessments without understanding the scope. You can't do a gap assessment. You can't say whether or not a control is reasonable and appropriate if you don't understand context.
You could say in a way that regulation is cyber threat intelligence. Also, just your adversary is the regulator, which could be more dangerous than actual attackers.
Yeah, because regulators are generally not going to shut down your business, but we definitely see cybercriminals do. So when you think about cyber threat intelligence, would you refer to it as proactive, reactive, or both? And then if you would put a little color to that and give me an example of how clients are using the CTI that you're providing them.
So probably both. I think you could make a case for being reactive and being proactive, basically based on what you want to do. You can go and actively collect things that bad actors know about you. Let's take an example from our world. One of the key things that we do, by the way, not because we think it's cool, but because cybercriminals use the same tools, so we want to do what they do. So we provide our clients with a good understanding of the cyber threat landscape. So one of the things that we do is monitor online markets in which threat actors sell access to compromised credentials. So imagine one of your employees being infected with an info stealer, with a very simple malware that steals credentials from their machine, and then these credentials are up for sale in an online market for anyone who wants to buy them. So one thing that we do there is monitor these markets and then allow our clients to proactively understand that an attack on an employee has happened and go and remediate that attack before an actual bad person buys the credentials and does something with that. So in that sense, going and actively collecting intelligence from the same places that adversaries do, that's kind of a proactive use case. Now, a reactive use case would be something that you do more kind of on a day-to-day basis. So enrichments. Say that you have a solution that goes through NetFlow data, extracts observables, so things that you see within your actual network traffic. What you can then do is compare that to cyber threat intelligence feeds that you get, kind of, again, in a reactive way. You see something, you check whether or not it's interesting, and that provides a lot of value as well. So I think proactive and reactive are two different facets of cyber threat intelligence. There's a big use case for both, and also a lot of different implications, a lot of different uses for how do you actually do that and how do you do that at scale. And I think kind of the thing that ties the two together and really goes down to how our clients and our users are using the intelligence that we provide is mostly on the lines of what I've mentioned before. So what we do best, at least I would say that, I'm a tiny bit biased, but I would say that what we do best is collect intelligence from, again, the same places that cyber threat actors use as well. So forums and markets and instant messaging platforms and so on. And what we then try to do is kind of extend the notion of attack surface management and cyber threat intelligence to really show you what bad people are seeing about your organization. That can come down to credentials that are posted in markets, that can come down to employee emails posted in third-party breaches, or it can be just your brand mentioned in discussions within illicit communities. And usually what our clients would do with that intelligence is take that, understand kind of the root cause, and then try to proactively defend themselves in a way that's more efficient.
Gotcha. So talking about a specific use case, right? So you mentioned, someone might use that credential, right? That would be early stage, prevent potentially like a malware or ransomware infection. Anything further down the attack chain, as an example, would be an example of how, you might provide information that would prevent them from being subject to a ransomware attack?
So I think the lines really blur across the cyber kill chain, kind of, because in a sense we're used to thinking about an attack as a linear thing starting in point A, where someone does something bad to my network or one of my employees, then linearly goes up until point Z or Z, because I'm talking to an American. So up until point Z, where I'm being monetized in one way or another, like via ransomware. However, in reality, and again going back to the ecosystem and going back to financially driven, what we see is a lot of small kill chains and not a one big kill chain, where you can see someone that infects an employee with a malware, then goes and sells it in a market, right? Sells the credentials in the market. That's like a small attack cycle that happened. Then someone else comes to that market, sees the VPN credentials for a US-based organization offered for sale, buys them, pivots through the network, establishes a foothold, stops there, goes and offers that network access, being an initial access broker, in a cybercrime forum. Then a different person comes, buys the access, goes through it, infects all of the machines on the network with malware, with ransomware specifically, and that's how we get from A to Z, but not in one linear path, but in 3 different paths.
Right.
In that sense, what us and a lot of different vendors, by the way, that's like the practice right now, are trying to do is to try and see where we can lodge ourselves in each one of these small attack paths that we can see. So we can provide strategic intelligence to try and help organizations prevent the first infection, like the one that led to credentials being sold in the cybercrime market. And ergo, we can try and be very proactive and very active in the chain. A different example would be that by identifying and going through these listings of initial access brokers for network accesses that they post in forums and markets, we can identify a victim and let them know that they've been compromised and help them like remediate the incident before they get ransomed, but a lot further down the first initial access. So I think that really differs. Cyber threat intelligence can be very early in the stage. It can be very late in the stage. It can be also outside of the cycle at all. Strategic threat intelligence, for example, knowing how many organizations in your sector and geography have been ransomed lately. If we just follow up on the ransomware example, would serve as a very good finding that you as a CISO, for example, can go to your board and talk about the things that you need to do to protect yourselves better from a strategic standpoint. So what are we going to do in next year's roadmap to try and prevent our next attack based on the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and and procedures that we now see being used by threat actors.
Yeah, so it seemed to me that this idea of different players in an ecosystem, right, the supply chain, gives us a little bit more, gives CTI a little bit more value because there is a time gap between the time, a party A establishes a beachhead and then sells that to party B, right? So if that takes a day or two, and we're able to, so it gives us that window, because if the same person did every step in the process, they could get through those steps very, very quickly, I would assume. And then one other question I would have for you is, you work in the, what I perceive as being something that we're seeing is that there is a longer window now between the time when somebody gains access into an environment and the time that they actually trigger the ransomware attack, because we see some fairly malicious things where they'll actually disable the backups, so, and then they'll wait 30 days or a week or 60 days, right? That because, otherwise if they find you've got offsite backups, then they can't compromise the offsite backups. Well, what do? Well, we'll turn off the backups. Most people aren't going to realize that, or we'll corrupt the backups and then we'll launch the attack. So all of those things give us, I think, a longer window where cyber threat intelligence would provide more value.
Correct. So I think that's an interesting observation. I would say the threat actors are becoming much quicker and streamlined. So sometimes you would see access being sold hours after the
Is it that fast?
Attack. Yeah. So it can be very fast.
Okay.
You can have very close-knit relationships between different actors. I do think that ecosystem can make things slower and provide more opportunities for defenders to intervene. I think more than that, more than the time aspect, there's the visibility aspect. So think about trying to deal with a foreign intelligence service. As, say, a small bank in the States, you don't have visibility into the internal communications of that foreign intelligence service that compromises you. However, with cybercriminals, with the right tooling, with the right vendors, with the right practice of knowing how to do cybercrime, cyber threat intelligence, you can have that visibility. Because unlike that foreign intelligence service that only speaks internally, using encrypted platforms and nation-state grade security, cybercriminals don't. Or at least not all of them do. They share information and adverts for sale on forums and markets, and they kind of have to bob their head out a tiny bit above the water to advertise what they have if they want to make money. So the financial and the market aspect is, aside of the kind of the MTTR that it provides you with visibility that you usually, like 5 years ago, 7 years ago, you wouldn't have had that, just because the cybercrime financial ecosystem wasn't as developed as it is now, and a lot of the CTI practice was directed towards nation states where and again, foreign intelligence services, where the kind of visibility and the kind of intelligence that you collect is very, very, very different.
Yeah, and then one other advantage we have, like you said, is there's a little bit of braggadocio. People like to boast. There's these hacker scoreboards and who's the first, and they post to show what they were able to, and you have to like post an image that truly demonstrates that you compromised this server. So I think that we have that as to our good fortune that that there's a little bit of competitiveness in all these people that are out there.
That is very, very much correct, and I think it also that kind of what I know a few other people and vendors in the industry dislike the phrase dark web, because dark web is like you talk about the dark web, you show a lot of vendors, or at least big parts of the media do, these images of icebergs, and that kind of resonates, that the cybercrime underground is huge and messy and scary, and it's kind of like a FUD tactic. It's fear, uncertainty, and doubt, where I think that in cyber threat intelligence and what some of the leading vendors in the industry are doing right now, we try to dispel that, is to explain and show that cybercrime is a financial market, it's an ecosystem, and as an ecosystem, you can map it out, you can understand it, you can research it, you can establish key competitors within that ecosystem and see how they talk to one another and what it is that they do and how they make money, and you can use that information and that intelligence to make better decisions as to how you better defend yourself. And I think that visibility and kind of changing the approach that we had, or that a lot of the industries had around the dark web buzzword for the last few years, that's a key component in what we try to do, is kind of shine a light and show you that what a lot of people talk about as an edge that goes for the attackers, because they have all of these secret forums in which they share like that super secret stuff. If you use that correctly, that's not an edge for the attackers, that's an edge for you, because you have visibility into the same places that they do. And I would say that's a very critical component in protecting digital business right now.
This was awesome. Anything we missed?
No, I think that I got all of my agenda. Like I could really go. Honestly, I could go about these things and like go into semi-philosophical areas for like 3 hours. So that I think was a good dosage for me as to not overkill.
Well, I appreciate you holding yourself back. So give me a real world or fictional person you think would make an amazing or horrible CISO, and why.
So for some reason, like 2 months ago, sorry, let me roll back a second. So for some reason, around 2 months ago, I rewatched Die Hard, like after a very long time that I haven't. Mind you, I'm like 32, so when Die Hard came out, I wasn't really in the appropriate age to understand it. So I rewatched it. I was preparing myself to not really enjoying, because like it's an 80s movie. How good can it be? I really did enjoy it. And I think John McClane would be both a very good and very bad CISO, because like basically he spends 2 hours running inside a building that comes down on him, being injured, being burnt, seeing people die, and that's incident response, right? And he's fairly good at it, so that's good. He brings in contractors from the outside. He knows how to delegate. He knows how to lead, so that's good. That would be the great CISO aspect. The horrible CISO aspect, I believe, would be everything else, like the way he treats his colleagues, the way he talks to people, the way he leads. I think that like when push comes to shove, John McClane would be a good CISO, though.
Is that the one that was the Christmas and He cut the bare feet and with the blood. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Classic incident response, isn't it? Christmas Eve, like check. Barefoot people walking around in a deserted office, check. So that's kind of your run-of-the-mill incident response.
Yeah, usually those incidents happen when you're, because the bad guys plan them at the times when, we're at our most vulnerable. It makes a lot of sense. So if folks want to get in touch with you, what's the easiest way to do that?
So I'm on Twitter, Raveed L, Raveedl. That's my handle. I'm also on LinkedIn, Raveed Laeb, so Raveed. That's Raveed, and Laeb is very weirdly spelled Laeb. So that's annoying. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. KELA is on Twitter as well, Intel_by_KELA. That's our Twitter. Come check it out. We're also on LinkedIn. So that would probably be the best ways to catch us.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you very much, John. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Same here.